The woods near Dusseldorf echoed with a single gunshot on May 12, 1945. Field Marshal Walter Model had walked among the trees that morning. He carried no note. His aide later recorded those final words. "A field marshal does not surrender. I cannot ask my men to do what I cannot." But his men had already chosen. Over 500,000 of them. 3 weeks earlier, something unprecedented had unfolded. The largest mass surrender in Western European military history. Not because of cowardice, not because of broken morale, but because continued fighting had become meaningless. What happened in those final weeks defied everything German military doctrine understood about warfare. Army Group B contained battle-hardened veterans, men who had survived Stalingrad, survivors of Normandy, soldiers who knew how to fight when encircled, yet entire divisions laid down their arms without firing shots. The Americans had unleashed something beyond superior firepower, something that made resistance not just difficult, not just costly, but completely irrational. April 21st marked the end. Over 325,000 prisoners processed. The Ruhr pocket cleared. American casualties remained minimal. German resistance had simply evaporated. But the story began weeks earlier, when American armored spearheads achieved what German doctrine considered impossible. April 4th, 1945. Dawn broke over the Rhine's eastern banks. The Lippstadt sector witnessed history. Complete encirclement of an entire army group accomplished in 12 days. Over 430,000 men trapped in a pocket roughly 50 miles wide. Field Marshal Model studied maps in his provisional headquarters. The story they told seemed impossible. American forces had surrounded combat troops, support units, supply personnel, stragglers, everyone. Numbers alone didn't make this unprecedented. German forces had faced encirclement before. Stalingrad taught brutal lessons. Falaise showed what happened when pockets collapsed. Countless smaller engagements across both fronts had ended in disaster. The Ruhr differed completely. What happened next violated every expectation. No desperate breakout attempts emerged. No suicidal last stands developed. No fanatical resistance to the final bullet. Instead, systematic surrender unfolded over 2 weeks, something that terrified German high command more than any weapon. Their soldiers had stopped believing. American forces called their method vertical development. That clinical term masked a revolution. Combined arms warfare had evolved through 3 years of combat, from North African deserts to the Rhine crossing. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7 Corps, had perfected something devastating. A system that made defending positions psychologically impossible. German propaganda had promised their troops would face soft Americans, inexperienced forces dependent on industrial might rather than fighting skill. Superior German training would overcome material disadvantages. Tactical excellence and willpower would prevail. Army Group B believed these promises. Veterans of the Eastern Front filled their ranks. Men who understood encirclement combat. Soldiers who had broken out before. Kursk and Kiev survivors who knew how to fight. Days after the pocket formed, entire divisions surrendered without combat. By April 18th, when Model dissolved Army Group B, over 317,000 had surrendered. Total captures eventually exceeded 500,000, when counting Luftwaffe, SS, and paramilitary units throughout the industrial region. The Germans encountered something beyond conventional military force. An integrated destruction system operating on principles they had never faced. Not from Soviets. Not from British forces. Not in any previous campaign. Americans had developed fundamental warfare evolution. The ability to make continued resistance functionally meaningless. No single weapon accomplished this. Seamless integration created the devastation. Air power, armor, artillery, logistics, psychological operations functioned as unified machinery. Every element reinforced others. Cascade effects made each resistance hour more futile. Model's final message before dissolving Army Group B revealed his understanding. The Americans do not fight battles. They stage industrial operations. Our men face not an army, but a system. Courage means nothing when enemies can predict every move, answer every action, make positions untenable before occupation. His suicide followed weeks later. No note remained, but his aide preserved those last words about field marshals and surrender, about asking men to do impossible things. His soldiers had recognized truth their commanders refused accepting. Americans had created warfare where traditional military virtues became irrelevant. Courage, tactical skill, determination meant nothing against calculated responses to every possibility. You couldn't outfight systematic prediction. You couldn't outmaneuver forces controlling every approach. You couldn't outlast enemies with supply lines stretching to untouched industrial heartlands an ocean away. The Ruhr Pocket story isn't about battle. It's about industrial age warfare reaching logical conclusions. When systematic approaches made resistance not just impossible, but pointless. 500,000 German soldiers didn't surrender through combat defeat. They surrendered because they had been made obsolete. German military doctrine that failed so catastrophically had been born from success. 5 years of continental conquest using devastatingly effective principles. Speed, concentrated force, tactical flexibility, superior training of individual soldiers, and small unit commanders. Auftragstaktik tactic represented this concept. Mission-type tactics, where commanders understood overall objectives and had authority achieving them through initiative. German lieutenants could react faster than American colonels receiving division orders. Decentralized command structure enabled consistent outmaneuvering of numerous opponents. From 1939, Poland, to 1940, France. From Balkans campaigns to initial Russian operations. This system worked brilliantly. German soldiers received extensive training, emphasizing independent thinking and tactical awareness. Squad leaders possessed authority, exceeding many Allied platoon commanders. Military culture emerged where small groups achieved disproportionate results through superior skill and initiative. By 1943, despite mounting losses and strategic setbacks, German tactical doctrine still produced impressive results. Kasserine Pass in February 1943 demonstrated this. Relatively small German forces inflicted humiliating defeats on American units in their first major engagement. Germans proved that outnumbered and outgunned forces could overcome material disadvantages through superior tactics and veteran leadership. General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded Allied forces in North Africa. Kasserine forced him to restructure American training and doctrine. Lessons proved painful, but clear. American forces needed fundamental combat approach changes. Raw courage and industrial output weren't sufficient against enemies who consistently outthought and outmaneuvered them tactically. But Germans made critical miscalculations. They assumed warfare would continue being decided by tactical engagements. Battles won by better-trained soldiers making superior decisions in individual firefights. They believed German tactical excellence could offset American material advantages. What they failed understanding was American goals. Americans weren't trying to win tactical engagements. They built systems making tactical excellence irrelevant. Between 1943 and 1945, United States military underwent unprecedented transformation. Not about creating better individual soldiers, though American training improved significantly. About creating integrated systems where individual tactical decisions mattered less than systematic operational superiority. American logistical preparation scale exceeded German military comprehension. By early 1945, American forces in Western Europe received support from supply networks, delivering 26,000 tons daily. Every American division crossing the Rhine had artillery support, delivering more tonnage hourly than entire German corps could fire daily. But logistics alone don't explain psychological collapse. Soviets had enormous material superiority on eastern fronts. Yet German forces continued fighting with desperate determination in hopeless situations. Budapest witnessed German and Hungarian forces holding out 50 days in siege, ending near total annihilation. Breslau garrison fought 82 days, continuing resistance after Hitler's death. Against Americans, that determination evaporated. The difference wasn't firepower. It was predictability and inevitability. American doctrine evolved into what Germans called Materialschlacht, material battle. But that term didn't capture psychological devastation. Americans developed systematic approaches where every German action triggered predetermined, overwhelming responses. Artillery observers called fire missions within minutes. Air support appeared within hours. Tank columns maneuvered to cut withdrawal routes before German commanders realized their positions were compromised. Americans didn't predict German moves through intelligence or brilliant generalship. They simply had resources preparing for every possibility simultaneously. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, operations chief of German Armed Forces High Command, wrote in his diary, March 1945, "Against the Americans, our tactical doctrine has become a prison. Every principle serving us well against Poles, French, even Soviets now works against us. Our flexibility means nothing when enemies prepare responses to every option. Our initiative becomes meaningless when every action triggers overwhelming retaliation. We fight opponents who don't need outthinking us. They've made thinking irrelevant." This was the context Army Group B entered when American forces crossed the Rhine. They brought tactical excellence, veteran leadership, determination to fights where none of those qualities mattered. They prepared for battle. What they encountered was industrial processing designed making battle impossible. German defensive preparations in the Ruhr represented culmination of 5 years' hard-won tactical knowledge. Army Group B wasn't green recruits or demoralized garrison troops. It contained 116th Panzer Division, Normandy Campaign veterans, 3rd Panzer Grenadier Division, which fought through Italy and France, 338th Infantry Division, Eastern Front survivors. These weren't men who broke easily. General Gunther Blumentritt commanded 1st Parachute Army within the pocket. He had personally overseen defensive preparations throughout January and February 1945. His planning documents, captured after surrender, revealed meticulous attention to 3 years' retreat lessons. Every position sited with interlocking fire fields, every bridge equipped with demolition charges, every crossroads pre-registered for artillery. Every likely American approach had prepared defensive positions. The Ruhr industrial region provided natural advantages. Over 4,000 factories, countless mine shafts. Urban areas perfect for defensive warfare. Terrain broken by rivers, canals, industrial complexes channeling attacking forces into predictable routes. German engineers spent months preparing positions, turning each factory, each urban block, each river crossing into killing grounds. Intelligence assessments captured from German divisional headquarters showed they understood American capabilities. They knew about artillery superiority. Their doctrine called immediate dispersal when American forward observers responded. They knew about air power. They planned operations during bad weather and prepared covered positions. They knew about American armor tactics. They prepared anti-tank positions in depth with carefully planned withdrawal routes. German commander confidence wasn't based on ignorance of American strength. It was faith in proven defensive doctrine. The Manual for Positional Defense, refined through years of combat, dictated that properly prepared defensive positions held by determined troops could exact casualties of 3 to 5 attackers for every defender lost. Mathematics seemed simple. Even if Americans had 3-to-1 superiority, attacking into prepared defenses should produce unsustainable casualties. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein commanded LI Corps. He had survived North Africa, Normandy, Ardennes offensive. His after-action reports consistently emphasized the same principle. American forces would attack until casualties became politically unacceptable, then pause to reorganize. German goals weren't winning. They were making victory too expensive. Every Resistance Day bought time for wonder weapons, peace negotiations, miracles that would stave off total defeat. Pocket defenders had ammunition stockpiled for weeks of combat. Food supplies consolidated from surrounding regions. Medical facilities established in safest rear areas. Communications networks linked every major position. On paper, Army Group B had everything needed for extended resistance. Colonel Wilhelm Weibig, operations officer for 15th Army, wrote in his journal April 3rd, the day before encirclement, "The Americans will find the Ruhr a far different battle than their race across France. Here we fight from prepared positions with our backs to our homeland. Here their speed means nothing. They must come to us, and we will make them pay in blood for every kilometer. We have studied their methods. We know their patterns. We are ready." But every assumption in German planning contained fatal flaws. They had prepared for battle. They calculated for combat where tactical decisions mattered, where terrain provided advantage, where determination and skill could offset material inferiority. They built fortresses designed withstanding siege warfare, as understood by military traditions stretching back centuries. What they couldn't prepare for was opponents who had evolved beyond battle entirely. Americans hadn't come to fight for the Ruhr. They had come to process it. The difference between fighting versus processing would become clear within hours of encirclement completion. Once German soldiers understood that difference, their carefully prepared defenses would become not fortresses, but prisons. What Americans deployed against the Ruhr pocket wasn't secret weapons or revolutionary technology. It was something far more devastating. Systematic operational integration refined into doctrine military historians would later call synchronized warfare. Innovation wasn't in single elements. It was in how every element functioned as parts of single mechanisms. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group staff developed the concept during winter 1944-45. Operations Officer Brigadier General Truman Thorson created what he called the Red Ball System, coordinated methodology where intelligence, artillery, air power, armor, logistics operated on synchronized timelines, making German tactical responses predictable and exploitable. April 5, 1945. 08:30 hours, first full day of encirclement. The system activated. American P-38 Lightning reconnaissance aircraft began flying grid patterns over the entire pocket at precisely timed intervals. Every camera pass numbered and catalogued. Photo interpreters at 9X Tactical Air Command Headquarters received developed film within 2 hours of each mission. They weren't looking for tanks or troop concentrations. They were mapping every German position, every movement, every supply dump, creating living pictures of entire defensive networks. By 1400 hours, first patterns emerged. German units repositioned to defend most obvious American approach routes, exactly as doctrine dictated. American intelligence officers marked these positions on master maps and calculated something Germans couldn't anticipate: timing of German movements. At 1600 hours, American artillery began firing on roads and intersections, not where German troops were, but where they would be in 30 minutes, based on observed movement patterns. German commanders reported to Army Group B headquarters that American artillery seemed predicting their movements. They adjusted, moving at different times using different routes. American photo reconnaissance documented changes. Artillery adjusted accordingly. Psychological impact was immediate. German after-action reports from those first days repeatedly used the word uncanny. American fire seemed anticipating every movement. Units repositioning at night found themselves under artillery fire at new locations within hours. Supply columns changing routes discovered American fighter bombers waiting at alternate crossroads. It wasn't intelligence superiority. It was systematic observation creating predictive patterns. Colonel Edwin Luther commanded artillery for 7th Corps. He had developed time-on-target methods to devastating perfection. When American observers identified worthwhile targets, Luther's system coordinated multiple artillery battalions firing from different locations, timing shells to impact simultaneously. German positions might see single-ranging shots. Calculate they had minutes before main bombardments and attempt displacement, only to have dozens of shells from 6 different directions arrive within 5-second windows. American artillery scale was something German veterans couldn't process. 3rd Armored Division alone had dedicated artillery support equivalent to what the entire Wehrmacht army in the pocket could deploy. When the 7th Corps called for corps-level artillery support, over 300 guns could fire coordinated missions. The Ruhr pocket contained approximately 800 German artillery pieces, but inadequate ammunition and constant counter-battery fire meant fewer than 200 could fire at any given time. But artillery was merely the anvil. The hammer was operational tempo. American armored columns didn't attack German positions. They bypassed them. Using radio communications and aerial reconnaissance, American commanders identified gaps in German lines within hours of their formation. Tank columns would exploit these gaps before German reserves could respond, cutting off entire units from supply and communication. 2nd Armored Division demonstrated this April 7th. Reconnaissance identified a 4-kilometer gap in German lines southeast of Hamm. Within 3 hours, Combat Command A had pushed an entire armored column through the gap, advanced 15 kilometers, blocked the main supply route for 2 German divisions. Encircled German forces discovered they were cut off only when supply convoys failed arriving. By then, American forces had established blocking positions too strong to break. Without major counterattacks, German forces no longer had fuel or coordination to mount. What made this psychologically devastating wasn't just encirclement, it was timing. German tactical doctrine emphasized rapid response to developing situations, but American operational tempo moved faster than German decision cycles. By the time German commanders identified problems, communicated orders, began executing responses, American forces had already advanced to next phases. Lieutenant Karl Godman, operations officer for 116th Panzer Division, wrote in his journal April 9th, "We are always responding to situations that have already changed. Our commanders make correct decisions for circumstances that no longer exist. By the time orders reach forward units, the Americans have moved and the orders are obsolete. We are fighting yesterday's battle, while they are already positioning for tomorrow's." The system wasn't perfect. American units still faced fierce resistance at key points, still took casualties, still encountered situations where German tactical skill created local advantages. But those tactical victories meant nothing within larger operational frameworks. German companies might successfully defend crossroads for 6 hours, inflicting casualties on American attacking units, only to discover American forces had already bypassed positions entirely and cut off withdrawal routes. April 12, 1945. The cascade began in earnest. What started as tactical defeats transformed into systemic collapse within German command structure. Breaking points weren't any single engagements. They were cumulative realizations that continued resistance served no purpose. American intelligence teams working with captured German communications equipment documented collapse in real time. Radio intercepts from German divisional headquarters revealed patterns. Initial confidence followed by confusion, then desperation, finally resignation. By April 14th, entire battalions were surrendering without American forces even approaching their positions. They simply walked out of fortifications and waited for Americans to process them. 9th Panzer Division provides the clearest example. April 10th, the division reported full combat readiness with 47 operational tanks and 4,200 combat effectiveness. Division Commander General Harold von Elverfeldt issued orders for aggressive counterattacks to restore German lines. April 13th, after 3 days attempting to execute offensive operations, von Elverfeldt reported to Army Group B. Every movement draws immediate artillery fire. Every concentration draws air attack. We advance 500 meters. American armor appears on our flanks. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place or surrender. April 15th, von Elverfeldt surrendered his division with 38 tanks still operational and ammunition for 2 more days of combat. When interrogated by American intelligence officers, he stated, "I surrendered not because we were defeated, but because fighting had become murder. I could achieve nothing except the death of my men." Psychological studies conducted by U.S. Army psychiatrists with surrendered German troops revealed common themes. Soldiers described helplessness unlike anything experienced on Eastern fronts. Against Soviets, individual courage and tactical skill could change local situations. Against Americans, nothing they did mattered. One German sergeant told interrogators, "Against the Russians, a brave man might survive. Against the Americans, bravery just meant you died for nothing." Industrial dimensions of American warfare manifested in ways German soldiers found incomprehensible. American units suffering casualties received replacements within days. Equipment losses were replaced overnight. Ammunition expenditure that would have crippled German divisions for weeks was considered routine by American standards. 3rd Armored Division fired more artillery shells April 13th than the entire German pocket fired during the entire week. But most psychologically devastating aspects weren't material superiority. They were methodical inevitability. American forces advanced on predictable schedules. They moved forward exactly as far as supply lines would support, then paused to consolidate. They didn't rush, didn't take unnecessary risks, didn't provide opportunities for German counterattacks. They simply ground forward like machines, impersonal and unstoppable. German soldiers began calling it Walzer Krieg, steamroller war. There was no glory in it, no opportunity for heroism, no way for courage or skill to matter. You couldn't ambush steamrollers. You couldn't outmaneuver them. You could only wait for them to reach you and then be crushed or step aside. By April 16th, American forces had processed over 150,000 prisoners. Supply infrastructure for handling surrenders became as sophisticated as combat operations. Prisoner processing stations operated on assembly line principles. German soldiers were disarmed, documented, given food and water. moved to rear areas within hours. Efficiency itself was demoralizing. Americans handled surrender of entire divisions with the same systematic efficiency they applied to combat. Field Marshal Model's headquarters maintained communication until April 17th. His final operational orders revealed a commander who understood the situation completely but couldn't bring himself to accept it. He authorized unit commanders to surrender if they judged continued resistance pointless, effectively dissolving his command while refusing to formally capitulate himself. April 21st, last organized German resistance in the pocket ceased. Final prisoner counts exceeded 325,000. Largest mass surrender in Western Front history. American casualties during the entire operation: 10,000 wounded, 2,000 killed. German casualties: approximately 10,000 killed in combat, the rest captured. Casualty ratios, normally favoring defenders in prepared positions, had been completely inverted. Eastern Front provided brutal context. In Courland Pocket, 200,000 German soldiers held out against Soviet forces until war's end, suffering over 150,000 casualties, but never surrendering en masse. In Heiligenbeil Pocket, German forces fought for 2 months with 80% casualties before final Soviet victory. Against Soviets, Germans fought to literal annihilation. Against Americans, they chose survival. Post-war studies by both American and German military historians identified the Ruhr Pocket as the moment when industrial warfare reached its logical conclusion. Americans had created systems where human factors became operationally irrelevant: courage, leadership, tactical skill. Not because German soldiers lacked these qualities, but because American systems had evolved beyond levels where those qualities could influence outcomes. General Eisenhower's report to combined chiefs of staff stated, "The Ruhr operation demonstrated that properly applied industrial-age warfare can achieve decisive results with minimal friendly casualties." The key is systematic integration of all combat arms operating at tempo that prevents enemy response. 500,000 German soldiers who surrendered rather than face continued combat hadn't been defeated in battle. They had been made obsolete by warfare forms that didn't require defeating them, only processing them. The distinction marked the end of warfare as previous generations understood it. When industrial systems reached points where human courage, tactical excellence, and military tradition became irrelevant variables in equations already solved by systematic superiority. Those German veterans who walked out of their positions in April 1945 weren't cowards. They were soldiers who recognized that the nature of war itself had fundamentally changed. They chose life over meaningless death in a conflict where their sacrifice would accomplish nothing except satisfying outdated concepts of military honor. The steamroller had arrived. They stepped aside.